Hello and welcome. My name is Tom Pesic. I'm a Senior Liaison Officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization's Liaison Office for North America, based in Washington, D.C. And I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for the webinar today. On behalf of FAO North America and McGill University, I would like to welcome and thank all of you for joining today's webinar on Overcoming Water Challenges in Agriculture, Canadian Perspectives on the SOFA 2020 report. Each year, through its State of Food and Agriculture report, one of FAO's major annual flagship publications, the organization seeks to provide for the global community balanced, science-based assessments of important issues in the field of food and agriculture. Each edition of the report contains a comprehensive yet easily accessible overview of a selected topic or theme of significant relevance for rural and agricultural development and for global food security. The 2020 iteration of the report focused upon water challenges in agriculture, which is what we have gathered here today to discuss from a uniquely Canadian perspective. Before proceeding with our program, there are a few important housekeeping items I would first like to cover. Firstly, I would like to advise you that this event is being recorded, and it is also being live streamed on Twitter at FAO North America. So please join the conversation on Twitter and follow us at FAO North America. Feel free to let us know who you are and from where you are joining us in the Zoom chat box. And please use the Zoom Q&A box to ask your questions, stating your name and affiliation, if any, and to whom your question is directed. I will not be able to make full and proper introductions for our distinguished speakers due to time constraints. However, their respective biographies will be made available to you in the Zoom chat box throughout our program. For your information, well over 800 persons registered for this event. So as you can see, there's clearly no shortage of interest in this topic and what our featured speakers have to say about it. Lastly, I would just like to provide a brief outline of how our event will be structured. In a moment, I will pass the floor to my FAO colleague, Vimlendra Sharan, to offer welcoming remarks. I will then give the floor to Jan Adamowski, who will provide welcoming remarks on behalf of McGill University. We will then hear a presentation from Maximo Torero, Chief Economist at FAO, who will set the stage for our discussion by providing an overview of the key findings of the SOFA 2020 report on water challenges, including water scarcity. Thereafter, we will have the immense good fortune of hearing keynote remarks from Laurie Tollefson, a major expert in agrology, in particular in irrigation and agricultural water management. We will then transition to a panel discussion which will feature distinguished speakers, largely from the Canadian provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, featuring Jennifer Nitchelm, Richard Phillips, Abdul Jalil, and Roger Peterson. Thereafter, we will hear reactions to what our panelists and keynote speakers have said from Sasha Kuoshima of FAO and Chandra Majramutu of McGill University. And thereafter, we will hear from all of you during our question and answer segment. And we will endeavor to end the session promptly at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I now have the pleasure of introducing Vimlendra Sharan, Director of FAO's Liaison Office for North America, based in Washington, D.C., to offer welcoming remarks. Very briefly, Vimlendra has served in this role as Director since December of 2016. He came to Washington from Rome, Italy, after having served as permanent representative of India to the Rome-based Food and Agriculture Agencies of the United Nations. Vimlendra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. And it's both an honor and pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this webinar today. At the very outset, let me place on record my immense thanks to Professor Chandra Majramutu, James McGill Professor at Bioresource Engineering Department at McGill University, for joining hands with us in organizing this webinar today. I'm sure Tom will tell you more about his accomplishments when he introduces him as a panelist. But for me personally and for FAO, Chandra has been a very dear friend and a great support over these years. So thank you, Professor Chandra, for your help and for your support to FAO. I must also thank all our speakers, our keynote speaker, our panelists, and also our FAO colleagues who join us from headquarters today, especially Maximo Torero, chief economist, who has been instrumental in putting together this report and has also taken time out to be with us today to give us an overview and key findings of this report. As Tom was mentioning, FAO produces State of Food and Agriculture reports every year with a specific focus area. For 2020, the report, which forms a context of our discussions today, the focus is on overcoming water challenges in agriculture. Now, while producing these reports is critical to establish evidence, I think it's also immensely important for FAO, for us, that these reports are picked up, read, and analyzed by member countries and used by them in framing policies and guidelines. That is, to me, extremely important and the real value behind these reports. And therefore, we really look forward to perspectives from national governments on the reports that we produce. Today, we are lucky to be getting the Canadian perspective on the 2020 SOFA. And therefore, I must say that at the webinar today, we are here not just to tell, but also to listen. We all know that water resources are under increasing pressure worldwide, and that sustainable and equitable management of water resource is a key element of sustainable food systems and perhaps essential for achieving zero hunger and nutrition. Amongst the various SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 6 specifically speaks to ensuring availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. But it is extremely important for us to remember that while SDG 6 may be specific to water, water actually is an essential resource and input towards achievement of nearly all other SDGs. So going forward, we need to keep in mind how we work towards sustainable and equitable and productive use of this resource, which is dwindling and diminishing with every passing day, especially in view of the impact which changing climate is bringing upon us. So with all this in mind, we thought it was extremely important that we organize this debate today and understand how Canada looks at water, what the Canadian perspective is towards use of water in agriculture, what are the innovations we are looking at, what are the investments we are considering. And to understand all this, it's important for us to move away from a very Ottawa-based perspective. So while Ottawa is very important to us, while government is extremely important to us, we also want the perspective of other stakeholders. And we have with us today not just the government representatives, we have academicians, we have researchers, we also have a farmer's voice talking to us. So I really look forward to hearing from all of you and learning from all of you. I'm sure our listeners will greatly benefit from the views and ideas that all of you expressed today. So thank you all once again for joining us for this webinar, our panelists, our speakers, our keynote speaker, our colleagues from FAO, and also all those who have joined us via Zoom. I think the number is now nearly 270 of you who are live on this. So thank you once again and welcome to this webinar. Let me stop here and pass the floor back to Tom Pasek.
Thank you, Vimlinger, for getting us started with those excellent welcoming remarks. I now have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Jan Adamowski, Director of the Integrated Water Resources Management Program at McGill University. Very briefly, Jan is a full professor in the Department of Bioresource Engineering in the Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences at McGill, where he is a William Dawson Scholar and a Lillian and David M. Stewart Scholar in Water Resources. He is also the Director of the Integrated Water Resources Management Program and Associate Director of the Brace Center for Water Resources Management at McGill. Without further ado, Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome everyone on behalf of McGill University as well as the Integrated Water Resources Management Program. McGill is involved in a diverse array of research projects related to food security, drought, water scarcity in different departments, different research groups, but also within different programs, as Tom mentioned, within our Integrated Water Resources Management Program and also via the Brace Center for Water Resources Management. I thought I'd mention a couple of areas of research that McGill is involved in the areas of drought, water scarcity, and food security. Just as an example, provide sort of a sample of what's being done at McGill. There's quite a lot of research being done in the area of drought forecasting using new artificial intelligence approaches. So for example, machine learning, deep learning, and trying to really assess how best to address issues like nonlinearity, non-stationarity in data, and also providing uncertainty assessments for drought forecasts. And that research, for example, is being done, among other places, in Ethiopia. There's also a lot of research looking at the impacts of climate change on agriculture and water resources. For example, Chandra Madramutu is well known in that area of research. A lot of that research is being done in Canada, but also internationally. There's a lot of work being done on exploring how can we make water use in agriculture not only more sustainable, but more equitable. And related to that, there's some interesting research being done at McGill on the topic of social ecological modeling of both agroecosystems and watersheds, and in particular, participatory social ecological modeling. So how can we identify and then meaningfully involve stakeholders in both the development and use of social ecological models of, for example, agroecosystems or watersheds. And there's been a focus recently at McGill on exploring that in the context of traditionally marginalized stakeholders. So for example, indigenous peoples in, for example, Guatemala, but also here in Canada as well. And more broadly, at McGill, there's quite a lot of research, both from a technical engineering perspective, but also from a more social sciences perspective, on how can we facilitate the complex transition to more collaborative, integrated, and adaptive water resources management. And as part of that, as Tom mentioned, we have an integrated water resources management program where we've trained over 500 students, both as part of the master's program and our online certification, in how we can facilitate that complex transition to more sustainable water resources management. That's certainly not an exhaustive list of the research that's being done at McGill, but I thought I'd provide a couple of examples of some of the research that's being done at McGill in the area of drought, water scarcity, and food security. Again, on behalf of McGill University, as well as the Integrated Water Resources Management Program, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you, and I look forward to participating in today's discussions.
Thank you very much, Jan, for those excellent remarks and for detailing for us McGill's important work on this topic. I now have the great pleasure of introducing Maximo Torero, Chief Economist at FAO, who again will provide an overview of the key findings of the State of Food and Agriculture Report 2020, which focuses on the theme of overcoming water challenges in agriculture. Very briefly, Maximo joined FAO in January 2019 as Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development Department. Prior to joining the organization, he was the World Bank Group Executive Director for Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay since 2016. And before working at the bank, Maximo had a long and distinguished career at the International Food Policy Research Institute. Without further ado, Maximo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much to McGill for FAO for this kind invitation. Let me share my screen with all of you. I hope you can see it now. So today I'm going to present the SOFA 2020, which the topic is overcoming water challenges in agriculture. And why? Because there is a need for urgent action to make water use in agriculture more efficient, equitable, and sustainable. And this is crucial, especially today that we're discussing of the agri-food system transformation. Now, clearly, water is central to achieving several of the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDGs 6, calls for ensuring availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. But water resources also play a key role for the other SDGs. Water resources are essential for improving food security and nutrition, livelihoods, health, and gender equality. They are crucial for increasing productivity, economic growth, and resource use efficiency. And they are at the center of the goal of restoring and conserving land and water resources and strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity. And this is something that today is even more important after what we are seeing. Unfortunately, as this report shows, achieving SDG 6 by 2030 will be a challenge. Demand for fresh water is increasing as population grows, incomes increase and diets change. Available fresh water resources per person have declined by more than 20% over the last 2 decades. And as shown by the figure, this decline has occurred in every region of the world. Freshwater scarcity is particularly serious in North Africa and Western Asia. And in these 2 regions, the average annual freshwater availability per person is below 1,700 meters square cube, the level at which countries' availability to satisfy the demand starts to be compromised. Increasing withdrawals of fresh water are also threatening water-related ecosystems and the livelihoods that depend on them. Climate change is disrupting rainfall patterns, causing increasingly serious water shortages in rain-fed agriculture. And these trends will exacerbate disputes among water users and inequality in access to water. Among the most affected are small-scale farmers and the rural poor and more vulnerable populations. And as you can see in the graph, the red line shows the 1,700, which is the minimum limit, and how we are very close, and even in the case of North Africa and Western Asia, we're under that important threshold. Given the importance of agriculture as the world's largest water user, measuring and mapping water constraints in agriculture is critical to identify hotspots as a first step towards devising appropriate interventions. 2 indicators developed by FAO are used in this report to measure water constraints in agriculture. The first one is the historic drought frequency, which is used to measure water shortages in rain-fed areas, both cropland and pastureland. And SDG 2 indicator 6.4.2 on the level of water stress, which is used to measure water scarcity in irrigated areas. These indicators show that about 1 billion hectares of agricultural land are facing severe water constraint, 1 billion hectares. Almost 800 million hectares of rain-fed cropland and pasture, or 14%, are severely affected by recurring drought, and 171 million hectares, or 62% of irrigated cropland, are under high to very high water stress. Again, this raises the emergency and the importance of this topic. The challenge of addressing water shortages is particularly severe for farmers in low-input production systems, those who use traditional varieties, mainly manual labor, and little or no application of nutrients or chemicals. The figure shows that the prominence of different types of production systems in each world region and how they are affected by water shortages and scarcity. The orange bars refer to the percentage of cropland under high input rain-fed production. The green bars represent the low input rain-fed production. The blue bars show that the share of cropland that employs irrigation. And for each production system, the darker colors indicate the share of cropland facing high to very high water constraints. The prevalence of different production systems can be seen as an indicator of the level of a country's agricultural development and its ability to address water constraints. Where high input rain-fed and irrigated production systems are prevalent, for instance in Europe and North America, farmers have greater access to modern inputs and infrastructure, including irrigation. They are better placed to cope with water constraints than in low input production systems. As shown by the bottom bar for the world, almost 40% of global cropland is under low input production. In low-income countries, the share is 77%. In sub-Saharan Africa, it reaches 83%. Less than 20% of the world's cropland is irrigated, but more than 60% of irrigated land is experiencing high to very high water stress. The report also estimates how many people living in agricultural areas are affected by water shortage and water scarcity. 3.2 billion people live in agricultural areas with high to very high levels of water shortage or scarcity. 1.2 billion people live in agricultural areas with very high levels of water shortages or water scarcity. These are the most severely affected areas. This means that about one in six people on the planet is affected by severe water shortages and scarcity in agriculture. Out of 1.2 billion people living in agricultural areas more severely affected, around 520 million live in Southern Asia and about 460 million in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. However, the incidence in terms of population shares is particularly high in Central Asia and in Northern Africa and Western Asia. In these two regions, about 1/5 of the population live in agricultural areas with a very high levels of water shortages or scarcity. In the remaining regions, between 1 to 5% live in extremely water-constrained areas. 5% may be perceived as negligible. However, it means that in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, about 50 million people live in areas where severe droughts has catastrophic impacts on cropland and pastorland. And these are areas where, for example, index insurance don't exist. So this makes even the problem even worse. Clearly, water shortages and scarcity in agriculture must be addressed immediately and boldly. Now, what is what the report is trying to bring? And let me recall here three main entry points of action that we bring in this report. First, the technical and management options at our disposal. Second, the institutions and legal framework needed. And third, the overall policy environment to promote sustainable water use. These are like the three legs of a stool. If one is missing, the stool cannot stand. Concerning the first entry point, many technical and management options exist to ensure efficient, sustainable, and equitable use of water, both in rainfed and irrigated agriculture, as well as livestock production and aquaculture. However, in order to adopt, options need to be appealing to farmers, and the incentives need to be aligned properly, and also to pastoralists, of course, and to fisherfolk. In order for these options to be adopted, we need effective institutional and legal frameworks. And this is the second leg of our stool. Effective institutions and regulations can promote effective water use in various ways. We need appropriate incentive systems, as I mentioned before, including the financial support and favorable trade terms, especially for small-scale farmers. We need to secure and transparent water and land tenure, which can empower users, promote efficient water use, and open opportunities for water markets. Third, community-based water use associations can bring together users to collectively manage water, and we have seen good experiences in several countries. But here, particular attention should be given to engaging women and non-consumption water users, like, for example, the fisherfolk, who are often disadvantaged and ignored. It is also crucial to understand the status, trends, and broader societal context of water resources. Water accounting and auditing can create proper information base for improved water management and strategies, and can also bring significant transparency. Finally, the third leg and final leg of our stool is the overall policy environment to promote sustainable and equitable management of water. Ensuring policy coherence across sectors and policy domains is the first condition for improving the management of water resources. Greater policy coherence across subsectors within agriculture is a further condition in order to avoid uneven and detrimental impacts across subsectors. For example, uncoordinated policies may favor irrigated farming to the detriment of rain-fed farming or inland fisheries. With 10 years to go, even less now, until 2030, all the three legs of the stool are needed if we are to overcome water constraints in agriculture and achieve zero hunger. We must understand that the Food System Summit and the Agri-Food System Transformation will create certain trade-offs, and water will play a crucial role here, and that's why the importance of this topic and the importance of this SOFA document. The most appropriate interventions and actions within the three entry points will depend on the types of agricultural production. I would like now to illustrate what are some of these most relevant options for rain-fed and irrigated agriculture, livestock, and inland fisheries. On rain-fed cropland, investments in rainwater harvesting and conservation can lead to major productivity gains, particularly if combined with improved farm practices such as drought-tolerant varieties. According to one study, water harvesting can and conservation could boost rainfed kilocalorie production by up to 24%. Herders working on millions of hectares of drought-affected pasture land can increase water productivity, for instance, by improving animal health and drought and through better use of pasture lands, feed, and drinking water. Productivity of irrigated systems can be significantly enhanced through investments in new irrigation systems or the rehabilitation and modernization of existing ones. However, water accounting and auditing, as well as effective water allocation systems, are critical for ensuring sustainable water use in the long run. For inland fisheries, policy coherence across agricultural subsectors is crucial. Inland fisheries depend crucially on the preservation of aquatic ecosystems, which are often sacrificed to the benefit of irrigated farming. Water development projects must consider the needs for inland fisheries in terms of water quantity and quality. Let me conclude by making some key points on the crucial issue of policy coherence and coordination. As we know, these are important for addressing sustainable development challenges. However, policy coherence and coordination are particularly relevant for management of water resources both across and within sectors and policy domains. For instance, the water sector can be significantly affected by policies in apparently unrelated domains, for instance, trade, energy, agricultural subsidies, poverty reduction. However, impacts on water supply and demand of such policies are often not considered. Interventions in one agricultural subsector can have negative impacts on other agricultural subsectors. For instance, excessive water withdrawals for irrigation can damage inland fisheries. Water harvesting upstream may reduce water availability for water users downstream. Only integrated decision-making can ensure effective and transparent decisions that avoid excessive water use and take into account the interests of all water users. A series of elements are key for policy coherence, and we can see this in this slide. First, strengthening trust between actors can ensure effective coordination and prevent conflict. This can be facilitated by the development of a common information base acceptable for all key stakeholders. Inclusive water accounting and auditing is therefore fundamental, as I mentioned before. Coherence strategies are needed across agricultural subsectors, rainfed and irrigated cropland, livestock production systems, forestry, and inland fisheries and aquaculture. And also, the provision of proper incentive is of critical importance. Often, general subsidies are pursuing other objectives to provide incentive for excessive and unproductive use of water resources and lead to water pollution. And by contrast, properly targeted subsidies can promote water productivity and ecosystem protection. And finally, effective regulations must be in place to protect environmental flows and water-related ecosystems. One potentially important policy tool are payments for environmental services, provided to farmers or landowners who agree to manage their land and watersheds for environment protection. We firmly believe that only immediate and decisive action along the lines proposed in this report can ensure a more sustainable and more equitable use of our ever more limited water resources now and in the future. So for us and for the food system transformation that we are looking for, this report is central, and we believe we need to take action as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maximo, for setting the stage for our discussion with that excellent overview of the report's key findings, including a detailed analysis at the macro or global level, as well as trends and dynamics at the regional level, including a number of options for overcoming water challenges. For our keynote address, I now have the great pleasure of introducing Laurie Tollefson, who serves as Vice President of the International Commission on Irrigation and Drainage. As many of you know, Laurie is a Canadian professional agrologist specializing in agricultural water management. He's a graduate of the University of Saskatchewan and has many, many years of work experience in irrigation and drainage. Laurie has represented Canada on numerous international assignments over the years in support of Canadian international development, marketing, trade, and foreign affairs. Without further ado, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom. We will bring the PowerPoint up, please, James, and I guess you will advance. Okay. Anyway, thank you, Tom. I was asked to speak this morning by FAO regarding overcoming Water Challenges in Agriculture with a Canadian Perspective. And it's in reference to the recently published FAO 2020 Food and Ag Report. I must say I enjoyed reading the document, and I found it well written and very insightful. It's been a number of years since I worked with FAO back in the early 90s, actually. So it's interesting to get back in contact with you again. Certainly, there are many common elements in the report, similar to our situation in Canada. But while saying that, though, it's important to remember that Canada's vast area, our large drainage basins, and our climatic variability pose different challenges, I suppose, from perhaps some of the other smaller countries with more homogeneous water issues. Obviously, there's no one size fits all, but I think it's a good chance for us to present this morning some of our challenges in Canada. My presentation this morning will emphasize irrigation, sort of in light of the FAO study, and with the panelists that we have. Okay, so if we could go to the first slide, please, James. Yeah, that's good. Change slides, James. Okay, thank you. So, Canada, to start with, is a water-rich country. There's some 2 million lakes and rivers, 20% of the world's fresh water we have, 7% of the world's renewable supply of fresh water. So in many ways, we're very rich and wealthy in the supply of fresh water. And we have 25 major watersheds that flow to the 3 coasts that cross international, provincial, and territorial boundaries. So these all add challenges to the management of the water. Federal, provincial, territorial, and indigenous governments share responsibility for freshwater management. But keep in mind that Canada is a federation with a national government and provinces and territories. So means management is a little different than some. There are a number of federal ministries, for example, and actually numerous federal ministries and agencies that deal with water management. But while saying that, the province, more regional jurisdictions have control over the allocation of the water to the other sectors, and agriculture is a shared sector. So suffice to say, there's lots of people involved in the management of Canadian water, and coordination and governance are certainly challenges. And we'll talk about that later as we get into my presentation. Next slide, please, James. Okay, so the background. So water in Canada, water withdrawal by sector. It's similar to many places. Electrical power and generation are our biggest withdrawal at 65%. Manufacturing is 10%. Agriculture is 7%. But again, keep in mind, agriculture is the largest consumer, and of course, within agriculture, irrigation is the largest consumer. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Mining and oil and gas extraction are something like 3% of the withdrawal. In our country, agriculture and agri-food is a critical sector of our society, and it generates some 140 billion in GDP and employs 2.3 million people. So it's a very important sector. And it faces particular challenges, though, in the context of climate change. Number one, as the largest consumer of water, but also as a sector with very diverse production systems. So it causes many variables. Next slide. Could we advance, please, Tom? Yeah. Okay. Then the next slide. Yeah. When we look at trends in Canada, the trends in Canada are in terms of farm size. We have fewer but larger farms, more specialized farms. Farm size, for example, in the west of Canada, in my home province of Saskatchewan, is something in the order of 1,700 acres is considered the average, or about 700 hectares. So the farm sizes today are very big. They're specialized. They're diversified in their crops, their domestic production, and for export production. Suffice to say, all this modernization has created a greater demand for water supply, and it creates a much bigger pressure on our environment. Okay, carry on. Next slide, please. So we move on to irrigated and rain-fed agriculture in Canada. So, as I said earlier, I'm talking about irrigation today, but irrigation really is small. Irrigation is practiced on 1 million hectares in Canada, and that's of our 44 million hectares of arable land. or something like 0.02%. So it's small. But irrigation provides a key support for drought mitigation, crop diversification, economic development, and value adding. I think we say in Canada, it certainly hits above its weight. You get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of economic and production. Our dryland agriculture, our non-irrigated agriculture is far more prevalent in Canada, and it has variations in precipitation, and soil moisture holding capacity certainly present challenges itself. For example, I grew up on a dryland farm, and so I'm very familiar with the vagaries of precipitation and not having enough. Developments today have improved water use efficiency, though. Research and water use efficiency has been improved, and drought management through things like conservation tillage, mulching, and drought-tolerant varieties. These have made great advances in our Western Canadian agriculture. Next slide, please, James. So the next slide, I want to take a brief look at the agriculture and irrigation in Canada. So for those that are not Canadian or from those from outside, this is a bit of a review of agriculture and irrigation in Canada. And I'm not going to go into a huge detail, but suffice to say the yellow lines along the bottoms are our borders with the United States of America, and the crosshatched lines are arid and semi-arid regions, and the green on the map is what we call our agricultural extent. So this is the area where agriculture takes place, and you can see there's a lot of land in Canada where agriculture is not possible. In Canada, surface water is our primary source for irrigation, and we irrigate over 1 million hectares. On the sidebar, you'll see that there's some irrigation in each province, small amounts in some provinces, more in others. If you look on the left of your screen, the western part of Canada, though, which is where a lot of my talk today is going to be centered, where drought and scarcity are a big issue, 80% of the irrigation takes place in that arid and semi-arid regions of Western Canada, or you can see on the left in the green bars. Certainly there's some regional differences. Western Canada, prairies, parts of BC and Western Canada, irrigation boosts productivity and is required in many crops. Whereas in Eastern Canada, irrigation is often supplemental and it used to overcome seasonal droughts. It's for quality parameters. And frankly, in the east of Canada, drainage is oftentimes a bigger issue, but certainly irrigation is important as well, no question. I should also add that one of the issues we have in Canada is that a lot of our population lives along the Canadian-American border. A good percentage of that population lives there, but our waters tend to drain towards the north. So although we have a lot of water, we're considered to have a lot of water, sometimes that causes issues in our supply of water. Next slide, please, James. So water scarcity. When we talk about challenges in Canadian agriculture, Western Canadian agriculture, water scarcity has been a major challenge in Western Canada since our land was first cultivated in the early 1900s. In fact, there was an early British surveyor in the mid 1800s who said much of the land that we see in Western Canada was contained within the Palliser Triangle, and that land was uninhabitable. Despite that warning by Palliser in the mid 1800s, the immigration and settlers were encouraged to come and cultivate our land in the west of Canada in the early 1900s. And what resulted from that were in the 1920s and 1930s, multi-year droughts caused provincial and national crises, the soil drifting and loss, economic, social impacts, farms are devastated, farms were abandoned. And in response to that, our Canadian federal government created an agency at that time called the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, whose job was to help recover from drought and economic disaster. And this agency was formed in 1935 as a Western regional agency, again, to drought-proof and to help recover from what we call the dirty 30s. And one of the things in terms of irrigation that PFRA did was the development of irrigation projects, some 26 of them, and 6 irrigation projects. Next slide. One of the proudest or the greatest accomplishments, though, of that Western organization was the development of Gardner Dam. And this dam you see in front of you was developed in the dry region of Western Canada, in the heart of our agriculture in many ways, a very dry region. It was completed in 1967 for purposes of drought proofing primarily, and also for other multi-uses, but at that time primarily for drought proofing. It was how it was envisioned. There was a potential to irrigate a lot of land, but currently only about 100,000 acres are irrigated from that dam, but there's a potential to irrigate much more, and we'll hear about that. One of the topics we're going to talk about later on is just the additional irrigation that's been announced that's going to happen, and sort of the process towards getting there. But just to say, this dam is a big dam. It was largest earth-filled dam in Canada, one of the largest in the world. Something total storage of 9.4 million dams cubed. It's been a drinking water source for 45% of Saskatchewan. So it's a multi-purpose dam, but it's clearly intended for biggest intent it was for irrigation initially. Next slide, please. Okay, the next slide. So in the west of Canada, we know that received climates. There's signs that's unequivocal. In fact, in Canada, Bush and Lemon, there was suggests Canada is going to warm at twice the global rate, with higher annual precipitation projected in particularly in the northern regions of Canada, which is going to have some impact on some of our hydrology, on the stream flows, probably some of the glacier flows at the point in time. But suffice to say, extreme weather events are being witnessed, are expected to be more frequent. Heat waves, excess drought, excess precipitation, and so forth. Just a couple of pictures at the bottom showing a drought-ravaged corn crop in Ontario and a Red River flood in our province of Manitoba. Next slide, please. So the next slide is the western area that we talked about, primarily where the irrigation is going to develop. This is a model that's been done by Agriculture Canada's Climate Monitoring Forecasting Group, and what it is, it's a moisture deficit map. So that you see in the west of Canada, in the Prairie region of Western Canada, you'll notice that models indicating something of a 2.5 to 4 degrees increase in temperature by 2069, also a 2 to 10% increase in precipitation. So we're expecting a greater moisture deficit and drought in those regions of Canada. And you can see in the map on the right-hand side, you can see the deficit. The deeper brown shows an increased moisture deficit, and certainly it almost mirrors somewhat of what was the Palliser Triangle many years ago. So certainly that is going to be an issue going forward. So many of the experts in Western Canada believe that though we could benefit very much from climate change. We see the additional heat units and the longer growing season allowing production of more long growing season crops and heat loving crops. Perhaps some crops that have been grown in the US or other places in areas that are dry or that haven't the irrigation the potential we have, maybe be able to be grown in the west of Canada. There are serious risks, however, to water availability on the prairies, and this accounts for some 80% of our farmland. So it's a very important issue to us. Increasing temperature could eclipse any of the gains, though, that from increased precipitation. So suffice to say that one of the challenges is going to be drought proofing, creating resilience, but irrigation expansion, many of us believe going forward is going to be very important. Okay, next slide, please. So the challenges. What are our challenges? So Canada agriculture faces many freshwater challenges. We've talked about drought and flooding. There's impacts of agriculture on water quality and quantity. There's competition with other users. We talked about that earlier, some of the other users, the competition. But the challenges that we see in Canada, being such a big country, challenges very much so regionally. There's drought on the prairies. There's surface water quality in the Great Lakes area, flooding in eastern Canada. And with that, climate change presents challenges and opportunities that are regionally specific, but require local response. And I think this is a very important key. Effective water management, including irrigation and drainage, we feel are very key to the adaptation to climate change. Another challenge is developing an integrated vision, and I think Maximo alluded to this in some of his discussion, is developing an integrated vision for water with stakeholders is very challenging because it's often very integrated. But it's important to develop the vision, but it's also important to getting it heard at appropriate levels. Next slide, please. And so we had a chance that this is a group of stakeholders were invited to a water vision exercise with our Prime Minister and our senior minister at that time, Ralph Goodale. And I guess the point being from this series of visioning that exercise, we were told we held discussions were talked about and on various issues, and a series of additional stakeholder meetings were held and recommendations were made. So just the point that it's incredibly important to vision and to have stakeholder sessions. And I'm sure Abdul Jalil may speak a little bit more about this as we go forward. Next slide, please.
Laurie, this is Tom. About 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, okay, Tom. Let's miss this one, Tom. We'll go to the next one. We'll go to factors to the opportunities. So next slide, please, Tom. So, okay, what are the, so we've talked about many of the issues, but what are some of the opportunities? Well, the opportunities are, as I said earlier, water infrastructure development. There's been recent federal and provincial announcements about infrastructure and developing the irrigation water infrastructure that's needed and required for Canada. There's opportunities to improve water quality to and from agriculture through research, through improved irrigation structures. I think that one of the major opportunities in terms of collaboration will be the Canadian Water Agency, which will be established to work collaboratively to keep our water safe and well managed. And another one I know that's an opportunity is to continue to improve water use efficiency and irrigated productivity through engineering, agronomic, and institutional approaches. We've done a lot of this in Canada, and I'm sure we'll hear this from some of the Albertans, but improvements in engineering, improvements in genetics, improvements in on-farm irrigation have allowed us to greatly and vastly improve our irrigated productivity, both in terms of water and crop productivity. And anyway, let's go to the next slide, please, Tom. So research, tech transfer activity drive this increased productivity, breeding and evaluation, infrastructure, new technologies like variable rate technology are all very important R&D activities to move the information from science to on-farm practice. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to show this slide because this is showing how productivity has increased in Canada. So you notice the graph. This is in Alberta, Canada, and suffice to say that the blue line is the water, the green line is yield. Notice in the early 1940s and 50s, the water use was high. We had poor irrigation systems, there was drainage, seepage, we had the genetics weren't there. Over time, over the years, you'll note that the yield has gone up and the water use has gone down. It's a classic example of water use efficiency that's been fueled by research and development. And a recent study showed that crop productivity increased in Alberta from about 4 to 12 kilograms dry matter per meter cubed in the past 30 years. So R&D and engineering and institutional approaches have been instrumental in this. One more slide, please, Tom, and then we'll. So finally, you asked me to mention international roles. Well, Canada has traditionally has been a very responsible water manager. I mean, we're known internationally as a water manager with excellent scientific and technical expertise and a history of collaborative management. And this engagement can be used to support such policies as promoting global peace, food security, and trade. So certainly we're interested and we have played in the international world, and we have the expertise to do so. But I just have one last slide and then I'll end it off, Tom. Okay, so I just wanted to say the International Commission in Drainage, there's an opportunity for people to work closer with international scientific agencies like ICID to transfer ideas. Canada has long used and been a supporter of ICID in gaining information and transferring technology. And many Canadians have proudly served with this organization. So with that, I'll wind it down there.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much for that outstanding presentation. You covered a remarkable amount of ground in a relatively short amount of time. So thank you very much for sharing all of those thoughts and perspectives with us. We will now transition to our panel discussion. And I now have the great pleasure of introducing Jennifer Nitschelm, who's the Director of the Irrigation Secretariat, the Agriculture and Forestry Department in the Government of Alberta. Jennifer has worked for the Provincial Government of Alberta in the Department of Agriculture and Forestry for the past 14 years. Without further ado, Jennifer, please share with us your thoughts and perspectives on these issues.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. And are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Oh, excellent. Lori, thanks so much for that excellent overview. I'll start with the overarching water strategy for the Government of Alberta, which is the Water for Life strategy, and it sets out three main goals. That third goal, the reliable quality water supplies for a sustainable economy, is really key to irrigation. So the department I work for, Department of Ag and Forestry, we support that Water for Life strategy, in particular focusing on conservation, efficiency, and productivity of water for irrigation. And as well, we oversee the legislation that irrigation districts operate under. Department of Environment and Parks also has a key role in irrigation, including that it operates provincial water infrastructure that often forms the headworks for irrigation. As well, it oversees the water legislation, including water licensing. Irrigation is an important economic driver to agriculture in Alberta. Only about 5% of the cultivated land in Alberta is irrigated, but that land produces about 20% of the provincial agricultural gross domestic product. Irrigation started over 100 years ago in Alberta. But by the mid-20th century, it was clear that one of the challenges was the cost of maintaining and rehabilitating the infrastructure and canals that exceeded what the direct benefiting irrigators could afford. And so as a result, the Government of Alberta, since the late 1960s, has provided annual grants to irrigation districts for rehabilitation or modernization of their infrastructure. And that has allowed districts to improve their water management technology and also has allowed them to replace many of their canals with underground buried pipelines, reducing water losses due to return flow, seepage, and evaporation. And we've seen significant improvements in the efficiency of the systems. Just within the last 20 years, we now have over half of that conveyance infrastructure is in buried underground pipeline. On the on-farm side, the individual irrigators have also invested in more efficient on-farm systems, generating significant water savings. Today, about 80% of the land in Alberta is irrigated by high-efficiency, low-pressure center pivots. And the Government of Alberta provides grants to irrigators to support that conversion and use of more efficient on-farm irrigation technology. And so as a result of the incremental improvements over the years, the amount of water that has to be diverted per unit of land has been reduced by almost half. And those efficiency improvements are key. It allows for economic growth in irrigation, particularly considering that within the late to mid 2000s, the river basins in Alberta where much of the irrigation occurs have been closed to new license applications, new water licenses. And so as a result, the improved efficiency is key for the irrigation sector to continue to be able to develop more land using the same amount of water and operating within the licenses that the sector has. So I'll just summarize by saying that the government of Alberta seeks to support a sustainable irrigation sector through legislative tools, technical support, and investment in infrastructure.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I now have the great pleasure of introducing Richard Phillips, who is the General Manager of Bow River Irrigation District in Alberta. Richard has been with the Bow River Irrigation District since March of 1996, initially as the district engineer and as the general manager since 2004. Richard, over to you. Please share your thoughts on these issues.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I'll just begin sharing my screen here. Are you seeing my screen now?
Not as of yet.
Okay, sorry, I'll just go back and one more attempt to share a screen. There we go. Okay, you're seeing it now?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay, very good. Okay, just a very brief presentation to introduce my thoughts on this topic, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. Speak about irrigation challenges in Alberta specifically. Most of the irrigation in Alberta happens within 13 irrigation districts covering roughly 1.5 million acres. Most of that occurring within a few large districts. There's also several very small districts. I manage one of those 3 large districts taking water from the Bow River, which accounts for nearly half of all of Alberta's irrigation. I'm going to use a few examples from the districts on the Bow River just to illustrate some of the issues that I see and also what's happening here. So in terms of challenges for irrigation in Alberta, I see both physical and social challenges. The physical challenge really is our water source is 100% surface water. We're not using groundwater for irrigation here. So we're highly dependent on precipitation from year to year, which is incredibly variable. The river flows are also extremely variable. And we have very limited water storage in Alberta, relatively speaking, only about 2.3 million acre feet for 1.5 million irrigated acres. So lack of storage and the variability of water supply year to year is a big issue. In terms of the social, several things at play here. Canadians aren't hungry. We certainly have more food than we know what to do with. Most of us have no agricultural connection directly, so food production is not something we think about in general. We're a nature-loving bunch of people. I'm one of them. We like our natural ecosystems and we like them to look beautiful and to be healthy. Alberta's definition of in-stream flow needs for healthy aquatic ecosystems is to have at least 85% of natural flow remaining in the rivers 100% of the time. And of course, we don't always achieve that, and irrigation is frequently seen as the primary culprit for not achieving that definition of a healthy in-stream flow. Some slides now in terms of what we've done with our water use here in 3 of the big Alberta irrigation districts. Blue line represents actual gross diversion in acre feet over the years. You can see the red line showing the steep declining trend, and the green line is the actual irrigated area every year. So since the mid-70s, over a 50% increase in irrigated area while actual water use is declining. If we look at that, the old normal used to be over 1 million acre feet per year. Our new normal is somewhere below 800,000 acre feet per year while experiencing that tremendous growth. Diversions are extremely variable depending on the weather, but we are diverting far less water, even though we are irrigating substantially more land. If we look at diversion per unit area, this graph again shows that steep decline in diversion per unit area. And comparing some years is interesting. 1993, an extremely cold, wet year, essentially used the same water per area as in 2015, which is a very warm and dry year. And 2017 was an extreme drought year, one of the worst 3 in the past 50 years. And yet our diversion per unit area was lower than in virtually every year 20 years ago. So we've seen some tremendous improvements here. Again, just looking at total diversion, again, going from well over 1 million to down into the 700 and some thousand range now is normal while experiencing that large growth in irrigated area. And why is that happening? Of course, the answer is it's improved efficiency. Two aspects to that: the on-farm application has improved, and the conveyance efficiency regarding the district infrastructure has also improved tremendously. Jennifer already referenced this, but there used to be, of course, a lot of flood irrigation here. It was dominant 50 years ago. There was still a lot of it 15 or 20 years ago and quite inefficient. Now, predominantly center pivot irrigation, which is much more efficient and allows far more precise irrigation as well. In terms of the district deficiencies, there's really 4 primary drivers. The single most significant one, I think, is pipelines. Canals lose water in a lot of ways. Pipelines, you simply don't lose water. So we've tremendously improved our efficiency through conversion of canals to pipelines. Balancing reservoirs are also key, and we've added additional balancing reservoirs to re-regulate flows within our systems. Automation and increased measurement of water within our systems have also contributed to that improved efficiency. Summary then, we are now extremely efficient, and future gains in efficiency will be relatively minor. Once you're highly efficient, it's hard to keep improving, and we'll get better, but we're not going to get better at the rate we have in the past. If we really want to expand irrigation, it's going to be critical that we increase our storage and better utilize the existing storage that we have to deal with climate variability. There's a lot of water available, and again, in Alberta, our storage is quite small. I was quite envious of our Saskatchewan neighbors looking at Laurie's slide with the immense amount of water in Lake Diefenbaker, which is not being used very heavily compared to the smaller reservoirs in Alberta that are being drawn on quite heavily. And then finally, back to the social, balancing environmental concerns with water use for human needs, including food production, is going to remain a challenge forever, I'm sure, here. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because there are many valid uses for water, including irrigation. So there's my introduction. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that very granular description of the vantage point from Alberta, Richard. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Abdul Jalil, who serves as the Assistant Deputy Minister for Western Economic Diversification with the Government of Canada. Dr. Jalil, over to you. In about 3 minutes, could you please share your perspective with us?
I think it's a pretty daunting task in 3 minutes, but thank you for the opportunity to participate on this panel. As a representative of the Government of Canada, who's based in the agriculture-intense province of Saskatchewan, you heard that water and food securities are 2 areas in which I'm passionate about. In reviewing the FAO State of the Food and Agriculture report, there are a number of things which jumped on me, but I won't go into any one of them because I think you heard it before. But I recognize that these are big challenges, especially when we consider that the global population could increase from 7.8 billion today to 11 billion by 2100, at which time some have estimated that the global food demand will be 80% higher than what we are doing today. Finding more land I'm talking about cropland, is not a viable option to meet this growing demand. Therefore, development and adoption of technology innovation policies will be part of the solution to achieve food security for all. Regions with capacity to sustainably expand agri-food production like the Canadian prairies will need to step up, particularly as some of today's key food production regions, such as the American Midwest, which relies on diminishing Ogallala aquifer. As illustrated by Western Economic Diversification Canada's report and video posted on our departmental website, this is where Saskatchewan and other Canadian prairie provinces have an immense opportunity and, in my opinion, responsibility to produce more food. We have been doing this for a number of decades because of innovative farmers and supporting federal and provincial government. It's in our DNA. My organization recently took a good look at possibility of expanding irrigation in central Saskatchewan by nearly 500,000 acres and the accompanying opportunities and challenges. In Saskatchewan, we are blessed with the most cropland in Canada, and South Central Saskatchewan, we have readily available water from Lake Diefenbaker, as Richard mentioned, a reservoir that was constructed in 1960s, which is fed by South Saskatchewan River. Various analysts have shown that the reservoir has a significant capacity to support expanded irrigation. When you consider these tremendous assets, as well as our world-class expertise in agriculture at University of Saskatchewan, at Global Institute for Water Security, at Global Institute for Food Security, one can see how Saskatchewan can achieve the goal set out in Provincial Growth Plan to increase agri-food exports from around 13 billion to 20 billion by 2030. This would go a long way towards helping Canada achieve goals set out in the economic strategy table for agri-food to increase agri-food exports from just over 60 billion last year to 85 billion by 2025, Achievement of these targets would contribute to global food security. In fact, our work, we concluded that expanding the availability of irrigation to more Saskatchewan farmers could accomplish three things. It would increase the resilience of our agriculture sector to climate change. It would help expand agri-food production in the province, which would in turn help feed a growing global population. By accomplishing the first two, it would provide an important and lasting economic opportunity that would drive prosperity for future generation of Saskatchewan. And in our study, I think when we estimated that this completion of these project could add about $85 billion to the Canadian GDP. Realizing the possibilities, particularly for Saskatchewan to expand irrigation, require a holistic vision and the development of irrigation in a sustainable way. We need to ensure planning, practices, and technologies that promote continuous improvement to water productivity and water quality. And that is to maximize social benefits while maximizing environmental impact, minimizing negative environmental impact. Indigenous right holders and other partners such as municipality, industry association, and environmental organization need to be engaged in meaningful way throughout the development of infrastructure and the lifetime of the project. We also need to maximize economic benefits by supporting investment attraction and bringing more food processing facilities to the province. With expansion of irrigation in Saskatchewan, potential environmental impacts could be mitigated in part through rigorous impact assessment processes, federally or provincially, to be determined. The last observation I would like to make is that economic development, in economic development, we are interested in things like multipliers and spin-off benefits. As such, the FA report recommendation concerning policy coherent core. If we get things right, we will enable learning and ongoing innovation that is in areas such as precision agriculture, nutrient management, irrigation system development, and breeding crops that are more drought resistant. That will be beneficial not only for Saskatchewan and the prairies and Canada, but to the whole world. Thank you.
A daunting task indeed, but you did very well. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Jalil. I now have the great pleasure of introducing Roger Peterson, who's an irrigation farmer from southern Saskatchewan. Roger is a passionate advocate for irrigation and has spent much of his career working to expand irrigation agriculture in Saskatchewan. Roger, without further ado, over to you, please.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, we'll get right to it. First, a general comment. I believe in Canada, there are too many agencies involved with water in some way or another. Right now, our federal government is conducting consultations about our Canada Water Agency. If this new agency is to succeed, it has to have an independent regional component. A good starting point, in my opinion, is to take a very close look at the work carried out by the former PFRA. It touched all the bases to address water issues, even in today's context of climate change. As I mentioned, my farmers in the 43,000 acre irrigation district at Outlook. The district is over 50 years old and was designed primarily for flood irrigation, the technology of the time. Now, transforming the district and our farms to pivot irrigation has obviously posed infrastructure and operational challenge, to say nothing of the financial burdens that follow. Our water tax has risen steadily over the years, but a dramatic jump recently to close to $50 an acre as we set aside more dollars for the replacement of outdated infrastructure. One of our biggest challenges right now is controlling algae and aquatic weeds in our main supply canal from Lake Diefenbaker. The problem is severe enough to reduce or even prevent water being delivered to farm supply laterals and pipelines. The district has been using a product called Magnesite H very successfully to alleviate this problem, but its active ingredient, acrolein, does pose a risk to fish. The Pest Management Regulatory Agency in Canada has approved the product for use in irrigation canals in Canada. The dilemma arises from the definition of natural fish-bearing waters. As irrigators, we maintain that irrigation canals are man-made and thus not natural fish-bearing waters. There are alternative products in use successfully in the United States, but to date, we have not been able to obtain registration for use in Canada. Another key challenge is public perception that increased irrigation will use too much water. This became very apparent to the Saskatchewan Irrigation Project Association that I'm involved with, as we talked about the benefits of irrigation expansion. We will continue to highlight that irrigators use the latest advances in application technology as it relates to total water usage. Finally, at the ICID conference in Saskatoon in August 2018, I had an opportunity to participate and visit with many people from around the world. Perhaps to my surprise, I learned that some of the water challenges we face are not all that dissimilar to many other countries. We here in Saskatchewan are indeed fortunate with the abundance of fresh water, but we must make the optimum use of that water, not just today and tomorrow, but protect it for generations that follow. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective for us. We now that we've heard from 4 of our panelists, we are now going to give the floor to 2 special experts who will react to what they've heard, both from Lori and Maximo, but also our panelists. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Sasha Kuoshima, who's the Deputy Director of the Land and Water Division at FAO in Rome, Italy. Sasha, over to you.
Thank you, Tom, and good greetings, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to have heard so many great presentations, especially in the Canadian case. At the Land and Water Division of FAO, Land and Water Resources, our business, as though it is the way how they're managed and used is central to our services to our member countries in improving food security across the world. In many of the developed countries in the world, while we have achieved big increases in agricultural production, actually tripled between 1960 and 2015, maintaining this historical pace in increases in production with just limited resources globally, I'm speaking from a global perspective, even in the well-endowed water countries, and in face of climate change, water scarcity and drought, these are all key challenges and pose sustainable issues raised by the SOFA report that our division had contributed greatly. And in many semi-arid countries, even advanced rainfed management or agriculture irrigation is just simply not available to the millions of smallholder farmers. And reducing their production potential, it causes a livelihood issues and resilience to shocks and local food security. And now with the pandemic, it adds additional layer to that complexity. So while we've been hearing a lot about agricultural production on the field, but I also wanted to raise the livestock, dependence on the system besides forest and the field crops. And they all critically depend on both not only availability, but the access to water, which also has the social and legal dimensions, which is another area that we focus greatly at FAO, is to provide the supply in the water for the supply and storage. That is the ecosystem benefits we've heard, but also for the use of agricultural production, whether they are for irrigated agriculture or aquaculture, for that matter, inland fisheries. And food services and consumption is all across the chain. That water is the most vulnerable to climate-related risk. So we're trying to address these issues through capacity building to our member countries in water accounting and governance assessment. Because in many other parts of the world, we just can't manage what we don't measure. And including these concepts is the water tenure, which is it's more than water governance. And as Canada is moving to a national water agency, the water tenure principle really would be helpful to enable planning at the country level, but also to support better allocation to all the communities, including Indigenous communities. We need to shift from also monitoring of water abstractions is basically what we traditionally monitor is how much we just withdraw, but to actual monitoring of water consumption. And I think Massimo Torero, I mentioned about this crop water evaporation, transpiration, is the real losses for that specific crop in that specific location given that climate. So it's an actual calculation of water consumed, and it better informs decision making. So we have been hearing a lot about supply management, but we also need to think about demand management in water. So at FAO, we help and we provide all this free of data on our portal on geospatial maps and the real-time remote sense derived data called WAPR, and Aquastat, which is at all the national country data on water. It's an open access and allows actors at different scales to improve their water management decision and gives the best available indication of agricultural water consumption, the consumption and the development for risk prevention models. As we speak, Land and Water Division of OECD and the OECD, the FAO and the OECD are co-hosting the roundtable on agricultural water financing today and also tomorrow is the second day to direct responsible and sustainable investments in water and to boost performance of sector institutions that's at the national basin or even local institutions to improve overall governance in the water sector on coherence and coordinated approaches. As we know that SDG 6 is falling behind its goal by 2030, and FAO's approach is to accelerate actions on agriculture and water. And these are fivefold with our UN water agencies and all the national governments. And we would like to catalyze water investments, digital transformation in data and information, capacity development, innovation, and governance. So we need to understand better the water balance to guide water-related investments. And farmers can improve their understanding on their water use and how that impacts the land and various management to optimize the system, not only at the field. And policymakers, development communities, and investors need to recognize the importance of consumption-based water resources monitoring as reference when aiming to improve the efficiency of water use in agriculture. Now there is a global shift towards sustainable food systems as part of the collective effort to accelerate the achievements of the 2030 agenda. So food system needs to think about not only water for food, water for ecosystems, water for human consumption, but also water for resilience. And this is the climate and the adaptation part. And this is where the shortcoming of water investment is. We need more investment in agricultural water to be able to grapple with all these challenges. So COVID-19 has highlighted the critical role of food systems in the recovery, and this is an opportunistic time for us to think about the food systems and transformation through the lens of agriculture water management, so that water is central to the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Back to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. You really packed in quite a bit there. Thanks very much. I now have the pleasure of introducing our key partner from McGill University in organizing this event, someone who's provided a lot of thought leadership on this, Dr. Chandra Majumuthu, who's the James McGill Professor in the Bioresource Engineering Department in the Faculty of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences at McGill. Over to you, Dr. Majumuthu.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon and good morning good afternoon to my colleagues in Rome and around the world, and good morning to our colleagues in Eastern Canada. Thank you very much to all of our panelists, our keynote speakers, for this very elucidating presentation. I want to start off with what I heard from Massimo Torero when Massimo presented to us those three legs or tripod to the stool of technology and water management strategies, the need for institutional and legal reforms and frameworks, and the policy environment as the third leg of the stool. And I want to tie that in to what just about every one of our panelists from Canada talked about. It's absolutely amazing that we could not have witnessed the kind of efficiencies, water use efficiencies increase in land and food productivity if we didn't follow in Western Canada and also in Eastern Canada the three legs of that tripod. You saw very vivid examples of where we've moved from surface irrigation to pivot irrigation and now to variable rate irrigation technologies. We've seen reforms in our governments. We've seen investments by our provincial governments in Alberta particularly, and now we're seeing investments jointly by the federal government and the provincial governments, particularly in Saskatchewan, for $4 billion. And there's been changes in the policy environment to support these investments to allow Canada to achieve the kinds of increased yields with less water diversions, as shown by many of our speakers. And I think this is remarkable as we think of how Canada has implemented much of what is in the SOFA report as expounded by Maximo. Let me say as well that one of the key points I've taken away from our speakers, and which is something we have talked about before in the former PFRA with Laurie and many colleagues in PFRA, is this whole aspect of water-based economic development. That water has multiple spin-offs when we apply all of the technologies and the reforms in the irrigation sector. We, as a matter of fact, are able to boost significantly the spin-offs that occur in the agriculture and agri-food sector and other parts of the economies in those provinces. And we heard Dr. Jalil talk about the potential increased impact of the 500,000 acres of irrigated land in Saskatchewan that would bring potentially $85 billion more to the Canadian economy. And I think that is a remarkable factor that we can generate so many significant investments as we start to go forward into economic achievements. The environmental issue remains a major concern to us, as we've heard from the speakers. And how do we balance that trade-off between agriculture, food production, and environmental flows and environmental safeguards? This will continue to be a challenge for us as we move forward. It is going to involve many stakeholders that are outside of the traditional agri-food sector, and how we listen to those points of view, we're able to incorporate those points of view without diminishing services to the agri-food sector. And I think an important point that was also made is the fact that how do we pay for some of these environmental services? And that also is an additional spin-off to the total socioeconomic well-being of the country, as we can pay for these environmental services, and farmers can be rewarded for being good stewards of land and water resources by implementing best management practices and conservation practices for water use efficiency. And so developing this integrated plan of water management is a challenge as we go forward, but I think there's certainly a tremendous amount to be done there. Along the lines of the environmental challenges is the whole question of salinity. And I don't think we should walk away from the fact that our Western prairie provinces are located in areas of dryland salinity, and there could also be potential for irrigation-induced salinity. We saw this in Alberta to some extent, and that's also what drove some of the improvements on pipelines and installation of pipelines to move away from canals, which encouraged seepage, and you started to have some groundwater salinization along the embankments of the canals. And so it's going to be important to implement high efficiency systems, and this is where variable rate technology comes in. It allows you to apply precise amounts of water so that you do not increase salinization, you do not increase leaching of agrochemicals to the root zone, and how do we form partnerships and for example, is what Alberta has done to provide financial incentives to farmers to implement some of these water savings technologies, because they also have the impetus to help to reduce the environmental problems associated with salinization and groundwater salinization. Let me close by saying how this all fits in a bit more into the global scene when I look at the SOFA report. There's mention in the SOFA report of two things that I think are very alarming that we should bear in mind, particularly as Laurie said, we want to develop Canadian expertise. We have a lot of Canadian expertise and technologies that can be exported internationally. And two factors I think are worth making note of. First of all, the point is made in the SOFA report that there's approximately about 180 million hectares, 60% of the 300 million hectares of irrigated land worldwide that is already being affected by water stress. And I think the challenge here is that much of that land is in Southeast Asia, in China, in India. And how do we protect those investments, large financial investments that have been made in irrigation systems? And I think this is something to be borne in mind as both Alberta and Saskatchewan expand their irrigation. They think very closely about water stress. And it's not just a matter of building the infrastructure to cope with water stress, but how do we protect those investments if there are impacts with respect to stress going forward. There's also talk in the SOFA report about 30 million hectares of land that could be brought into cultivation with improved water production from pump systems of groundwater, particularly in Eastern and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we need to bear in mind, there was mention of the Ogallala Aquifer, that there are already problems. And I think Sasha made a very good point. We don't monitor, we don't measure what we get out of systems. We don't even measure sometimes what we put into systems. And so we have to be careful if we want to expand that 30 million hectares of groundwater and shallow groundwater pumped irrigation systems. How do we manage those systems and be able to ensure that smallholder farmers are not contributing more to the problems of groundwater depletion in Sub-Saharan Africa? And I close by echoing Sasha's point. We do a bit of work, much more work in terms of monitoring what goes into irrigated agriculture, but we don't measure what's coming out. And so with all of the new technologies and satellite technologies and sensor technologies that are now coming onto the market, how can we make use of these technologies to be able to monitor not just in terms of yield and productivity benefits, but also what's going on in the soil and the water, to be able to assess carefully what we can do to move to more of demand management system. So thank you very much, Tom, for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Professor, for those excellent remarks. 3 points from my side quickly. First of all, as moderator, as we close out events, I typically try to synthesize what we've heard, but you have done an expert job of that for me. So thank you. That frees up some time for us for discussion. We are running short of time, but I propose that we extend just a little bit over time to allow for some questions. And then lastly, just to state the obvious, we've got about 24 questions submitted in the Q&A box, and clearly we will not get to all of those. So this will need to be an ongoing conversation, and we will share all of your questions with our speakers for follow-up after this event. I think if there's one common thread across all of what we've heard, it's on it's really on the need for equilibrium and balance in terms of managing competing demands and needs of interrelated sectors around water. And Richard, I think, emphasized something quite important in saying that we need to balance environmental concerns with the water use for human needs including food production and how that will be a major challenge well into the future. And so I would like to, and this sort of packages a number of the questions we've received from the audience into one. And I would like to ask each of our speakers to very, very briefly, in about 30 seconds or less, to respond to that question. I know there are no silver bullets in life, and particularly in this often complex sector. But for you, what are some of the biggest priorities and imperatives for most effectively managing this delicate balance? If I may, I'd like to start with Maximo Torero of FAO, and then move to Laurie, and then across our panelists. Maximo, 30 seconds, please.
No, thank you so much. I think the balance is on the three parts of this tool: technology, water management strategies, policy, environment, and institutional legal frameworks. If we don't have those, and we don't have the transparency of information on water accounting, I think will be very difficult to arrive to the balance. But we also need to understand what are the trade-offs and the trade-offs that policies will imply in terms of water use. And we don't have too much information today, and that's where we need to put an effort to be able to quantify those and to value those, so that people can understand how we need to improve efficiency in the use of those scarce resources like water. Thank you.
Thank you, Maximo. Laurie, over to you. Okay, as we wait for Laurie, we will definitely come back to him. Jennifer, if I could turn and ask your thoughts on this question.
In terms of the priority for water management, I think from an Alberta perspective, certainly managing within the variable and limited water supply that we have. Also want to touch on the importance of ensuring water quality for irrigation and agriculture, both for those sectors, but also the impact of those sectors on water quality, ensuring that we have adequate quantities and quality of water for all water using sectors and the environments in Alberta. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Richard, over to you. Your thoughts on managing the need for balance across competing demands, including water, with other sectors.
Yeah, I think that's the single most complicated issue involving water management. And I think it will vary tremendously from place to place. As I referenced, here in Canada, we're very well fed. Therefore, I think we have the luxury of paying higher premium to the environmental aspects of things. Having said that, I don't think there's anywhere on the planet that we would want a completely degraded environment where, every drop is being diverted out of rivers for food production. If you're in a place where people are hungry, though, certainly food production using irrigation is going to be a higher priority, I'm sure, than enjoying a beautiful aesthetic view of the ecosystem. Again, it provides real services too. I don't mean to make light of that, but it's all about what the priorities are within a region, recognizing that we all need food, and at the same time, a healthy environment is important to everybody.
Thank you, Richard. Over to you, Dr. Jalil.
Yes, I think I mentioned in my presentation that it is about collaboration, it's about cooperation. All the organizations involved, they need to sit together. And I mentioned about whether it's indigenous right holders, partners such as municipality, industry association, and environmental organization together, and figure out what's the best way move forward. And we also need to learn and apply all the innovation and technologies which have been developed in other parts of the world, bring them here and identify where the gaps are and move on fill those gaps.
Excellent, thank you. And Roger, over to you, please. Your thoughts on this question.
I'd like to throw out the term social license. I think that's going to be critical as we go forward with irrigation expansion in Saskatchewan, and certainly that's related to the environment and the efficiencies that we need to build into the expansion program that's been announced.
Thanks, excellent, Roger. And Laurie, over to you. I don't know if you heard my question, but I'll repeat it quickly. And this builds off of a comment Richard made about the need to balance environmental concerns with water use for human needs, including food production and the increased need for food into the future. What do you see as the key priorities for striking this balance?
I think very clearly the key priorities would be the collaborative approach that we're talking about, so that the various sectors or the various people are chatting or getting together and collaborating and developing some sort of a collaborative vision. I mean, as Richard said, food is abundant in Canada, but many times in the past in developing irrigation infrastructures, we haven't looked perhaps as carefully as we should have at environmental impacts. And I think, right from the very outset, we have to make sure that stream flows, environmental flows are done correctly, that they're considered right from the outset at developing some of these projects, and some of the both water quality and quantity parameters are looked at carefully and considerately. And this is through consultation with some of the partners, right? Making sure that people are in tune with what's happening. So, I believe that it's a huge priority, and I think clearly we haven't put enough impact on environmental resources perhaps in the past, but I think something clear that we have to go in future development projects moving forward.
Thank you, Laurie. And since you have the floor, in 30 seconds or less, what is your key takeaway message for our audience? If there's one thing they remember from your comments, what would you like that to be?
My comments. I think the fact that although Canada is a water-rich country, we have many similarities to some of the issues that are going on with FAO. We're a young country. People assume that we have an ample supply of water, but many parts of our country and our agriculture zone, water is scarce, and it's going to become more scarce as we go forward. And I think it's clear that we have to look at drought-proofing our agricultural lands, which I was showing the western part of Canada, which is 80% of the agricultural lands. Clearly, that has to be drought-proof going forward, and I think water scarcity simply has to be a major challenge going forward from a Canadian perspective.
Thank you, Laurie. Maximo, 30 seconds or less, your key takeaway message.
Sorry about that. Look, I think the major takeaway message for us is we need to strengthen trust between actors. We have to have better data to be able to bring transparency. We need to have coherent strategies across agricultural subsectors, and the incentives has to be properly aligned. Normally, that's where we fail. This policy coherence, I think, is central to be able to achieve what we are looking, so that we can use these resources in the most efficient way. We cannot assume water is granted. It will be one of the most important and scarce resources in the future, and we need to find a solution to be efficient and to bring proper policies and institutions in place to assure that we have the resource for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Maximo. Jennifer, if you're there, 30 seconds or less, your key takeaway message for the audience.
Certainly, I would say the importance of investing in technology to continue to have those efficiency gains and to support irrigated agriculture. I would also say ensuring that irrigation is financially viable and economically sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Richard, over to you.
Sure. Canadian irrigation is already extremely efficient. We've increased our irrigated land base by a large amount in Alberta in the past few decades, while at the same time actually decreasing our gross diversions. We'll get a little more efficient, but if we want to continue to improve irrigation, expand irrigation, it will be important to look at how we manage water, better utilize the reservoirs we have, and also look strategically at where we can create additional storage to use the water that we are already allocated.
Thank you, Richard. Dr. Jalil, 30 seconds or less, your key takeaway message.
Okay, I think I will just emphasize on the data, because we have information, but I would like to have more data so that we could make informed decisions.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, Roger, over to you, please.
I think I would just reiterate what I had mentioned before. I think a key is the social license to be able to do the irrigation expansion, and to emphasize that it's going to be done in a sustainable, environmentally friendly way to sustain our water resource.
Thank you, Roger. And so on behalf of FAO North America and McGill University, I would like to thank all of you in the audience for your participation and My apologies for our not getting to your many questions, but we will share them with the speakers and they can follow up with you afterwards. And of course, a huge thank you to McGill University and to our outstanding cast of speakers for sharing their insights and knowledge with us. But if I may, I would like to offer the floor to Dr. Majramutu to bring us home and close us out with some final reflections.
Thank you very much for this, Tom. Tom, I think as Canada looks to further irrigation improvements and expansion in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and other provinces, it would be very important for the Canadian, both federal and provincial governments, to look very closely at the irrigation expansion that took place in Australia and to see what occurred in the Murray-Darling Basin. Because many of the things we talked about today were faced by the, in a very similar way, Australia is Canada, in that we both have federal governments, we both have provincial governments that have a responsibility for water under the Constitution, and we have irrigators. And it took a lot of effort to get the Murray-Darling Basin Management Plan approved and accepted. And there are still a lot of challenges with that implementation of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. And so I think it would be wise, and they have issues with salinity, major issues with salinity, which drove, and water scarcity and drought, which drove the development of that plan. And so I certainly urge the Canadian authorities to look at this, both at the federal and the provincial governments, and take that to heart and look at the environmental aspects as well. So thank you very much. On behalf of McGill again, it was a pleasure to collaborate with FAO and to have such a distinguished panel of speakers and keynote presenters. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Stay safe and stay tuned.